Hey guys, tonight we slip past the velvet curtains of history into a side of the church you probably didn't hear about in Sunday school. We're talking about the papal throne, but not the halo-wrapped version. No, tonight you're getting the messy, scandal-stuffed, power-hungry saga of the medieval popes. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this if you're allergic to irony. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in Rome, the air thick with incense and sweat. The cobbled streets wind beneath golden basilicas, and banners of saints flutter above scandal-soaked whispers. This isn't the divine realm of angels. This is politics in cassocks. Here, being Pope isn't about prayer. It's about power, and not always the holy kind. Imagine being crowned as the vicar of Christ, and then immediately taking a mistress, hoarding gold, and assassinating your rivals. Yeah, that happened. Often. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, the papacy wasn't just a spiritual office. It was a throne of kings, often won through bribery, blackmail, or just plain old violence. In fact, some popes didn't even want the job. Others wanted it so badly, they'd pay entire armies to secure the keys of St. Peter. We'll get to those guys soon. For now, picture this. The year is 1045. A boy, not yet 20, becomes Pope. His name? Benedict IX. His vibe? Less divinely inspired, more spoiled noble teen with impulse control issues. But more on him next. For now we rest on the idea that the church, back then, wasn't so much a moral compass as it was a ticking time bomb of ego, envy and entitlement. Like Game of Thrones. If everyone was wearing mitres and speaking Latin. Mainstream historians agree the papacy during the Middle Ages wasn't always the beacon of holiness we imagine. It was a complex institution at the centre of European power, where being Pope could mean ruling armies, collecting taxes, and even crowning emperors. Some scholars argue the church kept civilization from collapsing entirely after Rome fell. Others? They call this era the Dark Ages for a reason. And here's a juicy fringe fact. There's a persistent and widely debunked legend of Pope Joan, a woman who supposedly disguised herself as a man and ruled as Pope for a few years in the 9th century, until she gave birth during a procession. Did it happen? Probably not. But it tells you a lot about how weird things got. People believed it was possible. Which kind of says everything. One thing scholars still debate, whether the Vatican's deep entanglement in secular politics was a necessary evil, or just evil, full stop. Some historians claim it was strategic survival in a chaotic world. Others believe the rot came from within, from cardinals and popes raised in privilege, trained more in swordplay than scripture. Back in our imaginary Vatican corridor, you catch the scent of roses masking something less sacred. You hear murmurs of secret tunnels, golden rings exchanged for silence, and blood spilled in the name of heaven. And here's the irony. While peasants kissed relics and prayed for mercy, their spiritual leader might have been upstairs in a gilded bathtub, counting bribes or whispering poison plots to a trusted aide. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You'll meet them all soon. The Pope who held orgies in the Vatican, the one who exhumed his enemy's corpse just to put it on trial, and the one who brought his pet elephant to war. Yes, elephant. Still awake? That's surprising. But hey, Maybe it's the dark humour or the flicker of candlelight behind your eyes. Either way, tonight's story isn't here to demonise, it's to humanise. Because behind every papal title, there was a man. And some of those men were, well, let's just say flawed is doing a lot of work there. So take a breath. You've stepped into a time where sin wore silk, where confessions came with conditions, and where forgiveness could be purchased for the right price. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Let the story begin. You're in Rome again, but this time it's messier. The city smells of spilled wine, roasted meat, and the ever-present whisper of ambition. You're standing in the Lateran Palace courtyard, watching a teenager strut by in embroidered vestments. That kid? He's the Pope now. And no, this isn't a religious allegory. It's Pope Benedict IX, actual Pope, actual teenager, actual disaster. He didn't just stumble into the job, he was shoved. Born into the powerful Tusculani family, young Theophylactus, because yes, that was his name, was installed as Pope in 1032 at around age 18, or maybe younger, depending on which chronicle you believe. He had no pastoral experience, no theological training, and, surprise, not a ton of interest in being Pope. He was basically a medieval trust fund kid, given the spiritual keys to Western Christendom. Historians almost universally agree. He treated the papacy like a social club crossed with a brothel. He was accused, by actual church figures, of hosting orgies in the Lateran Palace, selling church appointments to the highest bidder, and getting excommunicated more than once. And here's the kicker. He didn't just become Pope once. He held the office 3 times. It's like he couldn't decide whether he wanted the job or not. The first time, he gets chased out of Rome by angry mobs. The second time, he bribes his way back. The third, let's just say the church was getting real tired of his on-again, off-again relationship with spiritual authority. But the moment that seals his legacy in the book of What Were You Thinking comes in 1045, when he sells the papacy. Yep, he literally hands over the title of Pope to his godfather, Gregory VI, in exchange for a tidy sum of gold. And you thought modern politics was transactional. Mainstream scholars are united on this one. Benedict IX was one of the most morally questionable popes in church history. Even Pope Victor III, a future pope himself, described Benedict's life as a life of rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts. That's not exactly a glowing performance review. Here's the fringe detail that always gets raised, even if it's more legend than fact. Some sources claim Benedict planned to marry, which is part of why he resigned. He allegedly fell in love and decided to leave the church so he could tie the knot. And yet, he came back. Twice. So either it didn't work out, or he was the kind of guy who wanted both cake and communion. Now here's where scholars still argue. Was Benedict IX truly that depraved, or was he the victim of later smear campaigns? After all, much of what we know comes from chroniclers who were, let's just say, not fans. Some historians propose that he may have been less wicked and more wildly incompetent, which honestly isn't much better. You picture him now, pacing the marble halls barefoot, sipping wine from a jewel-encrusted goblet, while scribes record his latest proclamation, probably written after a night of debauchery and questionable cheese. Outside, angry Roman nobles grumble. Inside, young Benedict is just trying to remember if he left his papal ring in the fountain again. But eventually, even this saga wears thin. After his third papacy, yes, third, he disappears from the records. Some say he died in a monastery, repentant and quiet. Others think he just faded away, his story swallowed by time and shame. Either way, he left behind one very clear legacy. Never give a teenager unlimited power, a palace, and zero adult supervision. You let that thought sink in as the candle beside you flickers slightly. There's something oddly comforting about the chaos of the past. Even popes were a mess sometimes. And isn't that oddly relaxing? The stars are quiet over Europe, but the church is not. You drift now to a strange, uncomfortable era in papal history, where things don't just go sideways, they go triangular. Imagine three people all claiming to be the one true pope at the same time. Welcome to the Western Schism, where divine right got stuck in a three-way argument with absolutely no chill. The year is 1378. The papal throne is already wobbly. Rome is unstable. France is meddling. And the cardinals. They're divided like your relatives during holiday politics. The church is supposed to represent unity, but suddenly you've got two popes. One in Rome, one in Avignon. And both are shouting, "I'm the real pope," like kids fighting over a toy crown. So naturally, the church fixes this by adding a third pope. Yep. In 1409, a council decides to elect a new guy to settle the dispute. His name is Alexander III. But instead of solving the mess, it just means there are now three popes, each excommunicating the others, all wearing the pointy hat and insisting they've got the hotline to heaven. Mainstream historians describe the Western Schism as one of the greatest crises in the church's history. It shattered public confidence. Kings didn't know which pope to support. Bishops were stuck in limbo. And the faithful, just confused. Imagine trying to confess your sins and not knowing which pope's forgiveness actually counted. The fringe detail. There's a half-serious theory that some of the cardinals deliberately created chaos just to weaken the papacy's grip. Divide and conquer, but make it theological. One particularly wild theory suggests that secret deals were made with secular rulers to keep the church fragmented, because nothing says spiritual warfare like backroom diplomacy and double-crossing bishops. But the big scholarly debate centers on responsibility. Who caused the schism? Was it political manipulation by France? Arrogance from Rome? Or maybe the structure of the papacy itself? Too much power, too few checks, and too many silk robes clouding people's judgment. Even today, historians disagree on the primary spark. You imagine it now. 3 rival papal courts. One in Rome, bustling with ancient marble and desperate cardinals. One in Avignon, walled off with French finery and whispered alliances. And one, well, kind of just winging it, hoping the others implode. It's like medieval reality TV, except instead of a rose ceremony, everyone's getting excommunicated. There's even an awkward moment where all 3 popes claim to have been chosen by God and declare the others anti-popes. That's the actual term, by the way. Anti-pope. Sounds like a supervillain, doesn't it? But this was very real and very serious. Wars were fought over these rival claims. Entire kingdoms chose sides, and at one point, even the cardinals weren't sure who was in charge anymore. The schism finally ends in 1417 at the Council of Constance. All 3 popes are deposed or step down, kind of. It's messy, but the church elects a new pope, Martin V, and declares peace. Problem solved. Ish. Trust had been broken. The illusion of unity shattered. And cracks that started here would later lead to something even bigger, the Reformation. But that's a story for later. For now, you drift through a time when truth had 3 faces, when faith had 3 thrones, and when the most powerful religious institution on earth couldn't even agree on who was in charge. Kind of comforting, isn't it? Even the medieval church had a group chat argument that got way out of hand. Tonight, the moonlight filters through the narrow windows of a Roman courtroom, not a courtroom full of judges in powdered wigs, mind you. No, this one has a throne made of velvet, a corpse in papal robes, and a pope shouting accusations at a dead man. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod, a real trial held in 897 AD against the rotting corpse of Pope Formosus. Yeah, you heard that right. A dead pope on trial. Because apparently, excommunication wasn't enough. You had to humiliate someone even after they decomposed. The mastermind behind this ghoulish legal circus, Pope Stephen VI, bitter, paranoid, and maybe just a little unhinged. He had inherited the papal throne after a series of quick successions, intrigue, and possibly poisonings. But Stephen was obsessed with undoing Formosus's influence, so he ordered his decaying predecessor's body dug up, dressed it in full papal regalia, and hauled it into court. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, Stephen actually appointed a deacon to speak on behalf of the corpse. The poor guy had to stand there, answering questions on behalf of a guy who'd been dead for 9 months. As you do. Mainstream historians agree. The Cadaver Synod was one of the lowest, most bizarre points in papal history. It damaged the church's credibility and made the papacy look less like a spiritual office and more like a Monty Python sketch written by someone having a nervous breakdown. The fringe detail? Some fringe theorists think this wasn't just about politics. It was a symbolic act of cleansing. That Stephen believed Formosus had somehow cursed the papacy. And this trial was meant to exorcise that spiritual contamination. Whether that's true or just convenient madness, we may never know. But what scholars do debate is what actually triggered Stephen's rage. Some say Formosus supported the wrong emperor. Others think it was a deeply personal vendetta tied to church appointments and land disputes. Either way, after Formosus was found guilty, yes, guilty, they cut off 3 of his fingers, the ones he used to bless people, stripped the corpse of its robes and threw it into the Tiber River. So much for turning the other cheek. The fallout was immediate. Rome was horrified. Stephen's enemies turned against him. Not long after, he was imprisoned and strangled in his cell. Poetic, in a grim sort of way. The Cadaver Synod was later annulled and Formosus was reburied, though no one really knows where. You picture it now, a dark marble chamber, torchlight flickering across the shriveled face of a dead pope propped upright, as Stephen paces, sweat pouring, voice rising with every accusation. Outside, the people whisper. Inside, madness reigns. Historians still scratch their heads at this one. It's so surreal, it almost sounds fictional. But multiple sources confirm it, and if nothing else, it proves this truth. Medieval papal politics could be as theatrical as they were terrifying. And weirdly enough, the Cadaver Synod became a kind of grim bedtime tale passed down through Vatican gossip. Centuries later, it's still used as shorthand for things have gotten wildly out of hand. So if you ever feel like your workplace is dysfunctional, just remember, at least no one's putting skeletons on trial. The shadows shift now, warmer somehow, like you've stepped into a Renaissance painting laced with gold leaf and sin. You're in the Vatican once more, but this time everything glitters a little too much. Laughter echoes through candlelit halls, perfume hangs heavy in the air, and down the corridor, someone is definitely plotting something. Enter Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, perhaps the most infamously scandalous pope of all time. If the papacy had a villain origin story, Rodrigo would be its main character. Elected pope in 1492, yes, the same year Columbus stumbled into the New World, Alexander VI didn't waste any time making headlines. He threw banquets. He appointed his teenage son a cardinal. He hosted events that would make HBO blush. And that's just a Tuesday for this guy. He fathered at least 7 children, publicly. His most famous offspring? Cesare Borgia, a ruthless military commander who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince, and Lucrezia Borgia, whose reputation was so toxic it still fuels Netflix dramas. Though to be fair, some of the worst rumours about her are likely exaggerated. Mainstream historians paint Alexander as both cunning and corrupt. He was a master of political manoeuvring, leveraging alliances with European nobility and keeping enemies at bay through bribes, threats, and occasionally suspicious accidents. He turned the Vatican into a family business, literally filling key church offices with relatives, friends, and anyone willing to pay enough gold florins. Here's your fringe tidbit. There's a long-standing rumour, likely false, but disturbingly persistent, that Alexander once held a banquet known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, where courtesans danced nude among scattered chestnuts while guests, including members of the clergy, competed in, let's just say, very unholy games. Whether it happened or not, the fact that people believed it says a lot about his brand. As for the scholarly debate, it's all about motive. Was Alexander VI just another corrupt Renaissance politician who happened to be Pope? Or was he sincerely trying to strengthen the church, albeit by wildly immoral means? Some argue that his nepotism was strategic, placing loyal family members in power to defend the papacy during unstable times. Others say, nah, he just liked power, money, and throwing parties with suspiciously high wine budgets. Now picture this: velvet-draped chambers in the apostolic palace, Lucrezia twirling in gold-threaded silks, Cesare sharpening his sword in the next room, and Alexander, wine in hand, negotiating with kings and cardinals between bites of roast pheasant. He even divided the entire world between Spain and Portugal with a single papal decree, the line of demarcation. That's how powerful he was. He drew a line on a map and said, Spain, you get this half of Earth. Portugal, that half's yours. And people listened. But all things corrupt must come to an end. In 1503, Alexander VI suddenly fell ill and died. Some whisper it was poison. Others say malaria. There's even a theory that he accidentally drank poison meant for someone else. A poetic death, if true. At his funeral, few mourned. Some even looted the papal apartments before the body was cold. One account describes his corpse swelling grotesquely and turning black, forcing attendants to jam it into a too small coffin with a stick. Divine judgment, or just bad embalming, depends on who you ask. Still, his legacy lingers. Alexander VI became the poster child for everything reformers would later rail against: corruption, luxury, abuse of power. Yet even amid scandal, he expanded papal influence and reshaped Europe. Go figure. You rest in this contradiction now, how one man could be so reviled and yet so influential. A pope who kissed babies and stabbed backs. A father, a schemer, a shadow in silk, and somehow still not the worst we'll meet tonight. The night air shifts again, this time tinged with lavender fields and faint notes of political awkwardness. You're not in Rome anymore, you're in Avignon, France, where the popes decided to take a, let's say, extended vacation. One that lasted nearly 70 years. It begins in 1309. Pope Clement V, pressured by the French crown and probably tired of Rome's chaos, moves the entire papal court to Avignon. And once they settle in, lavish new palaces, lush vineyards, less Roman rioting. They kind of never go back. Imagine this, the head of the Catholic Church, seated not in the eternal city, but in a cushy French estate, surrounded by cardinals who all coincidentally owe their careers to French nobility. They called it the Avignon papacy, but critics preferred something sharper, the Babylonian captivity of the church. Yikes. Mainstream historians often describe this era as one of spiritual disconnect. The popes were seen as puppets of the French monarchy, distant from the heart of the church. And while the Avignon court flourished with art and scholarship, it also racked up some pretty jaw-dropping expenses. These popes knew how to live well. Some would say too well. Here's a fringe tidbit. During this time, the Avignon popes built an actual private wine pipeline from the nearby countryside to their kitchens. That's right, liquid luxury on tap. You thought your office perks were good. But the scholarly debate is whether the Avignon papacy was a necessary compromise or a profound betrayal of church integrity. Some argue the popes were protecting themselves from Rome's violence and instability. Others believe they abandoned their flock in favor of comfort, wealth, and political favoritism. And just when things couldn't get messier, they do. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI finally returns to Rome, but he dies shortly after, triggering that Western schism you heard about earlier. Remember the three popes? Yeah, that drama starts right here. You imagine the papal entourage packing their robes, books, and gold icons, boarding a caravan of carts heading back to Rome after decades away. But Rome isn't welcoming. The city is crumbling. The politics are vicious. It's like moving back into your childhood home and realizing someone spray painted your bedroom with graffiti and there's a wild boar living in the hallway. The Avignon period had changed the papacy. The people expected more pageantry, more wealth. And the popes had grown used to a certain level of luxury. Back in Rome, the Vatican had to reconcile its spiritual mission with the image of popes lounging in imported tapestries and making diplomatic decisions between banquets. And let's not forget the growing resentment. Reformers began speaking out more loudly. Why was the church spending so much on marble thrones and gold candlesticks, while the average peasant couldn't afford bread? It was a quiet fuse, one that wouldn't explode until the 16th century, but you can already smell the smoke. Still, there's something sleepy about Avignon. You picture the Rhône River gliding by as cardinals sip wine in the garden, the papal palace gleaming under the sun, like something out of a storybook. And somewhere in the library, a monk's candle flickers as he writes a letter he hopes someone in Rome will one day read. But for now, the popes are content in their French fortress. Rome waits, wounded and resentful, and Europe shifts under the weight of this absence. Powerful monarchs growing bolder, reformers sharpening their pens, and the people beginning to ask, what exactly is the church anymore? You let that question linger, not to answer it, but to feel its echo, even now. You're jolted gently by the sound of hooves clacking across cobblestone. Not horses though, just one massive creature, bigger than anything you've seen in the Vatican annals. It's an elephant. And it's not lost, it belongs to the Pope. Specifically, Pope Julius II, the warrior Pope, the man who wasn't content to sit quietly on the papal throne. No, Julius wanted swords, sieges, and yes, elephants. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he became Pope in 1503, just after the chaotic reign of Alexander VI. And where his predecessor had oozed scandal, Julius thundered with ambition. He donned armor, personally led troops into battle, and stormed cities while shouting orders like a general. Because apparently, sometimes being pope means charging into a siege with a plume in your helmet. Mainstream historians consider Julius one of the most powerful and aggressive popes of the Renaissance. He fought to reclaim the Papal States, unify Italy, and crush those who dared oppose him. He also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which means he could pivot from war crimes to art curation in a single afternoon. But let's talk about his elephant. Named Hanno, this enormous creature was a gift from the King of Portugal and became Julius's favourite companion. Hanno was pampered, paraded, and reportedly taught to bow on command. Imagine a ceremonial procession down St. Peter's Square with bishops, cardinals, and a war elephant flapping its ears like it owns the place. The fringe rumour. Hanno was also part of an astrological experiment. Some claim Julius had court astrologers study the elephant's behaviours to predict omens, like a papal pachyderm horoscope. There's no solid evidence, but the idea of a pope asking, "What do Hanno's dreams mean?" is too weirdly adorable to dismiss. Here's the real debate. Was Julius a bold reformer using force to strengthen the church, or just another power-hungry noble who wore holy robes like armour? Scholars still argue. Some praise his vision and his refusal to be a puppet. Others call him a brute in silk, more interested in conquest than Christ. You picture him now, striding through Vatican halls with mud on his boots, bellowing orders while Michelangelo rolls his eyes in the background. He once yelled at the artist for taking too long on the Sistine ceiling, because naturally, Julius thought the Last Judgment should be delivered on a tighter deadline. He was loud, impatient, and he had the mouth of a dock worker. It's well documented that Julius II cursed like a sailor. In fact, he swore so much that diplomats began including his insults in official reports, often in Latin. Now that's dedication to the record. And yet, for all the chaos, Julius left behind a stronger, more centralized papacy. He saw the church as not just a spiritual force, but a political one, something that could unite Italy under the banner of St. Peter. Whether that was divine strategy or just really aggressive urban planning, well, history hasn't quite decided. Still, it's hard not to smile imagining Hanno lumbering down the Vatican corridor, cardinals scattering in his path. Julius, trailing behind, sword in one hand, rosary in the other. Holy war, Renaissance style. And somewhere in the distance, Michelangelo mutters, "I'm never doing another ceiling again." The room smells faintly of incense and gold. Lots of gold. Tonight, you're sinking into the heart of a scandal that stretched across generations and tainted every corner of the church's hierarchy. Simony. That's the fancy word for selling holy stuff for cash. And yes, it got really out of hand. You're now sitting in a cathedral, watching a bishop slip a bag of coins under a velvet tablecloth, whisper something into a cardinal's ear, and walk out with a shiny new church title. No exam, no spiritual training, just gold, influence, and sometimes a well-placed cousin in the curia. Simony gets its name from Simon Magus, a magician in the New Testament who tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well. But that didn't stop medieval popes and clergy from turning blessings into business transactions. Mainstream historians agree, by the 11th century, simony had become one of the church's worst open secrets. Entire bishoprics were sold to the highest bidder. Priests were promoted, not for their piety, but for their purse. One pope, Leo IX, even wrote in horror about children being promised church offices they couldn't assume until they were old enough to hold a chalice. Fringe story. There's a tale, mostly anecdotal, that one nobleman paid for a cardinal's hat using a team of racehorses and a golden bathtub. Whether true or not, the imagery is hard to forget. Gold, steeds, and sacraments. Because what's faith without a little flair. But scholars still debate how deeply simony corrupted the church. Some argue it was simply a survival tactic. Popes needed money to run armies, hospitals, and diplomacy. Others claim it rotted the spiritual foundation of the church from within, turning the pulpit into a prize and holiness into a hustle. And it wasn't just bishoprics. Everything was for sale. Mass pardons, relics, even indulgences. That's right. You could literally buy your way out of sin. Feeling guilty about stealing a goat? Pay a few coins, get a slip of paper, and boom, absolved. This system helped fund cathedrals and crusades, but also triggered fury among reformers. You'll meet a few of them later. For now, just picture a world where your place in heaven had a price tag. Wealthy nobles bought their salvation in bulk. Poor peasants, not so much. Some popes fought simony, of course. Gregory VII tried to crack down during the 11th century reform movement. He launched excommunications, set up councils, and railed against clerical corruption. But the temptation of wealth was strong. Too strong. Imagine the irony, a church preaching poverty, grace, and humility, while secretly auctioning off spiritual authority like concert tickets. It's like if your yoga instructor asks for bribes to reach enlightenment, kind of kills the vibe. You wander now through a Vatican antechamber, where silver coins clink in the candlelight, and names are scribbled onto parchment, each with a price beside it. One for a bishopric in Florence, one for a monastery in Marseille, one for a child not yet born but already promised a holy title, and somewhere in the corner, a weary clerk sighs and dips his quill in ink, because even corruption needs paperwork. Simony wasn't just a bad look, it was the spiritual rot that made critics sharpen their pens. Reformers began whispering. Monks wrote furious treatises, and the laity, they started asking why their prayers weren't being heard unless they came with a coin purse. It was, in many ways, the crack in the dam. But the flood hasn't come yet. You rest now in this uneasy stillness, where salvation is for sale, piety is performance, and the holiest offices in Christendom come wrapped in velvet and receipts. You wake, still dreaming maybe, as the air turns colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Gone are the velvet halls and wine-drenched feasts. Tonight, you find yourself in a stone chamber beneath flickering torchlight. Chains clink softly, iron gates groan open, and a voice mutters prayers through clenched teeth. This is the other side of the papal coin, the one they don't put in stained glass. Because sometimes, popes ended up in chains. Not every pope lived in splendor. Some were dragged from their thrones, thrown into dungeons, beaten, poisoned, or quietly erased. Power, after all, has enemies. And when you're a pope with a crown and a sword, someone's always plotting your downfall. Let's start with Pope John XII, elected at age 18, because apparently medieval Rome loved teen popes. John quickly gained a reputation for moral flexibility. He turned the Lateran Palace into something resembling a frat house and reportedly toasted the devil during banquets. Subtle. But when political alliances soured, Emperor Otto I had him deposed. The reasons were numerous: heresy, murder, simony, adultery, allegedly with his own niece, and general conduct unworthy of a pope. The weirdest part: John briefly regained power before dying, some say during a romantic encounter. Others whisper he was beaten to death by a jealous husband. Either way, not very saintly. Mainstream historians confirm multiple popes were imprisoned or exiled. Pope Martin I was abducted by Byzantine agents and tortured. Pope Silverius was exiled to a remote island by Empress Theodora's orders. Pope Leo III was attacked in the streets, his eyes gouged and tongue cut. He survived barely. Here's a deliciously dark-fringed tidbit. It's rumoured that Pope Clement II, who died suddenly in 1047, may have been poisoned by Benedict IX. You remember him, the teenage pope from earlier. The twist, it might have been holy water. Yeah, sanctified murder, if true. The debate among scholars, whether these imprisonments were purely political, or if some of these popes genuinely posed a spiritual threat. Was the emperor defending the faith, or just removing inconvenient clerics? The truth is murky. Motives were always wrapped in incense and wrapped in royal seals. You walk the dim halls of Castel Sant'Angelo, Rome's ancient fortress-turned-prison. Beneath its marble towers, popes once hid from mobs. One even used a secret passage, the Passetto di Borgo, to flee the Vatican and vanish into its depths. The corridor still exists, a winding, cobbled artery of papal panic. And while some popes ruled with iron fists, others lived in fear of assassination. Poisoning was a popular method, easy to slip into wine, easy to blame on divine judgment. At least a dozen papal deaths have been rumoured to involve poison. Though, to be fair, medieval record-keeping wasn't always precise. Cause of death, suspicious grapes. But the image that lingers now isn't the palace, it's the prison. A pope in rough wool robes, shackled, staring through a barred window at the basilica dome he once called home. The silence around him thick as scripture. He prays, not for power, but for release. Not all popes ended in glory. Some ended alone, betrayed by the very people who crowned them. And somehow, that makes them more human, flawed, fragile, and sometimes finally, forgotten. But not tonight. The torchlight softens now, flickering lazily as you drift into a more intimate corner of history. We've left the chains behind, but don't relax just yet, because now we wander into the boudoir of the papacy, those candlelit corners where vows of celibacy went to die. Tonight's theme, let's call it celibacy, schmelibacy. You probably already know that Catholic clergy, including popes, are supposed to be celibate. No wives, no children, no romantic distractions. In theory, it's about purity and spiritual focus. In practice, well, the Middle Ages called. They'd like a word. Let's start with Pope Pius II, who wrote vivid love poetry before becoming pope, and continued to write steamy fiction while in office. That's right. The man tasked with leading the world's largest Christian flock also moonlighted as a romance novelist. Imagine if your local bishop had a spicy Kindle account. That's the vibe. Then there's Pope Innocent VIII. Oh, the irony of that name. He had at least 8 illegitimate children and openly acknowledged them. He arranged strategic marriages for his sons and daughters, turning the Vatican into a matchmaking hub for Europe's elite. At his funeral, people joked that the papal bed had seen more activity than the confessional. Mainstream historians generally agree that many popes, especially during the Renaissance, didn't take celibacy all that seriously. They had mistresses, lovers, concubines. Some even kept families inside the Lateran Palace. One pope, Sixtus IV, allegedly fathered multiple children while preaching against immorality. A true multitasker. Fringe fact? There's a persistent rumour that one pope maintained a hidden garden within the Vatican walls, where his lovers would be escorted by candlelight, their identities masked by silk veils. It's the kind of story that probably isn't entirely true, but then again, no one's ever really disproved it either. The open scholarly debate. Whether the church turned a blind eye on purpose? Was it quietly understood that powerful popes were expected to have lovers, so long as they kept it discreet? Or was celibacy seen more as a guideline than a commandment? Historians are split. Some say it was corruption. Others argue it was cultural. Everyone in power had affairs. The popes were just following the trend. Of course, some popes tried to follow the rules. They took vows seriously, slept alone, prayed fervently. But those popes, rare and often short-lived. It's hard to stay virtuous when you're surrounded by wealth, power, and velvet curtain privacy. Imagine now the winding corridors of the Vatican at midnight. Soft footsteps, a cardinal looking the other way, a whisper behind a curtain, and in a nearby chamber, a pope pens a letter by candlelight. Not to a bishop, but to a beloved mistress in Florence. This wasn't the kind of scandal that made headlines back then. It was expected, even choreographed. Nobles sent their daughters to Rome not to marry, but to charm. Being a papal mistress was practically a career path. Some women wielded enormous power, influencing decisions, appointments, even doctrinal debates from behind the throne. And if you're wondering how this all stayed quiet, well, it didn't. Satirical poems, gossip songs, and woodcut prints circulated like wildfire. The people knew. They joked. They rolled their eyes and confessed their sins while their Holy Father tucked love letters into gilded drawers. So tonight, as the candle burns low, you're left with an image not of robes and rosaries, but of secrets behind silks, of love letters stained with wine, of a church built on vows and broken by whispers. The lantern flickers again, and the velvet turns darker, thicker, as if the very air is soaked in intrigue. Now, you're walking through shadowed Roman parlours, where the real power behind the papacy wasn't always the man wearing the mitre, but the women whispering in his ear. Welcome to the papal pornocracy. No, that's not just a dramatic nickname. Historians actually use that term, pornocracy, to describe the 10th century period when Rome's spiritual heart was effectively run by a handful of powerful noblewomen, especially one family, the Theophylacti. At the centre of it all, Marozia. Marozia wasn't a pope. She wasn't even clergy. But she was a Roman noblewoman with enough political cunning to rival any emperor. She seduced, married, and manipulated her way through popes and nobles alike. Some say she was the mistress of Pope Sergius III, the mother of Pope John XI, and the puppet master of multiple other papal reigns. Imagine the Vatican like a chessboard. Marozia was the queen, and the popes. Just bishops. Mainstream historians agree. This era was a low point for papal moral authority. The papacy became a tool for local aristocratic families to control Rome, enriching themselves while installing popes like pawns. Elections were rigged, decrees bought and sold, and if someone opposed you, well, accidents happened. One fringe legend claims that during this time, the papal palace hosted theatrical blessing ceremonies, where cardinals would pretend to bless Marozia and her lovers in ritual mockery, then return to their wine, laughter echoing down the marble halls. May or may not be true, but hey, it tracks with the general vibe. And scholars still argue about how bad it really got. Some say the term pornocracy is exaggerated, rooted more in later church embarrassment than fact. Others say it was even worse than we know, with key documents lost or destroyed to protect reputations once the papacy was cleaned up in later centuries. Marozia eventually overplayed her hand. After trying to install her son as pope and rule through him, she made too many enemies. She was arrested and imprisoned by her own grandson, no less. Family drama, but make it medieval. You wander now through the Lateran Palace, its candle-lit corridors filled with the ghosts of whispered conspiracies. One pope, John X, was allegedly smothered with a pillow under Marossia's orders. Another vanished entirely after refusing to play along. Power was traded like perfume, and behind every robe, a whispered name. It's strange, isn't it? In a church that officially barred women from leadership, the most powerful figures of this age were women behind the scenes. Not saints, not scholars, but political tacticians, seductresses, and survivors of an age when the Vatican was less cathedral, more crime family headquarters. Still, even amid the scandal, the institution endured. Popes came and went. Rome burned and rebuilt. And somehow, the marble pillars of St. Peter's stood through it all. Tonight, you lie quietly in the shadow of a woman who ruled popes like chess pieces, who turned a vow of celibacy into a suggestion, who made the Vatican dance to her tune, and then vanished into a cell, history's door slamming shut behind her. The candles flicker, the stories deepen, and the sins grow silkier still. The night takes on a colder stillness now, not from silence, but from secrets. You're no longer walking brightly lit halls or sneaking glances through royal veils. No, this time you're listening for footsteps, watching for shadows, waiting for whispers that might never be written down. Because tonight we enter the realm of papal curses, conspiracies, and revenge. You're back in Rome, but not the postcard version. The streets are tense. Eyes follow you from under cloaks. There's talk of poison in the bread, of cardinals dropping dead unexpectedly, of dreams where saints weep blood and enemies die. Strangely fast. One of the eeriest stories, Pope Urban VI. He ruled in the late 14th century during the chaos of the Western Schism. Urban had a temper like burn the house down temper. He once accused 6 cardinals of plotting against him and had them tortured. Their screams echoed through the papal palace, and Urban. He reportedly scolded the torturers for not making them scream loudly enough. Mainstream historians agree Urban was paranoid, cruel, and probably unstable, but somehow still Pope. Some even say he began plotting against his own allies, convinced that everyone was out to get him. Honestly, they probably were. Fringe detail incoming. There's a persistent, undocumented rumour that Urban placed a death curse on one of his enemies, a cardinal who died days later, suddenly and inexplicably. Whether it was poison, stress, or coincidence, no one could prove anything. But the Vatican kitchen staff suddenly started drinking only from their own cups. And then there's Pope Boniface VIII, the guy who tried to excommunicate the King of France. Big move. Bigger mistake. The king sent men to kidnap him. Boniface was beaten, humiliated, and possibly tortured. He died shortly after, and French rumour-mongers claimed he went mad. One legend says his ghost still haunts the Vatican library, mumbling about crowns and insults in Latin. Some scholars debate whether these deaths and disasters were divine justice, political consequences, or just the cost of ambition. Was Urban VI evil, or just reacting to centuries of betrayal? Was Boniface arrogant, or was he standing up for papal authority in a world that had stopped listening? The church, after all, has always been both temple and throne. When someone threatened the balance, popes struck back, sometimes with edicts, sometimes with poisons, and sometimes with patience. A long memory is more dangerous than a short sword. One tale tells of a cardinal who betrayed a reformer pope. The pope forgave him, publicly. But 10 years later, that same cardinal slipped on a staircase, broke his neck, and died. People whispered that the steps had been waxed just enough. Maybe, maybe not. In papal politics, coincidence is just a conspiracy without paperwork. You picture it now, a locked Vatican archive, scrolls wrapped in crimson ribbon, candles burning low, a name scratched hastily in the margin, a vial hidden behind the altar wine, a prayer, a curse, a plan. Even in holiness, revenge found its way in. Not all popes were patient, some were petty, others were terrifying, and some, like Urban or Boniface, seem to operate on a level of paranoia that makes modern workplace drama look like Recess. But whether by dagger, decree, or destiny, the papal throne has always attracted enemies. And popes, they didn't always turn the other cheek. Sometimes they turned the screw. So sleep lightly tonight. There are stories that still haven't been told, and some names scratched in Vatican margins have yet to fade. You wake with the feeling that someone just slipped out of the room. A chill of vanishing footsteps, a whisper of incense fading into air. That's fitting, because now we follow the trail of a pope who didn't just bend the rules, he disappeared. Meet Pope Benedict X, or as some call him, the Vanishing Pope. His story begins in 1058 with an election. Kind of. Depending on who you ask, Benedict was either lawfully chosen by Roman nobles or unlawfully shoved into the office by family connections and bribes. The church, let's just say they were not thrilled. It wasn't long before the opposition cried foul. Reformers wanted him gone. The Holy Roman Empire wanted someone else. So, in true medieval fashion, a rival pope was elected, Nicholas II, and war broke out between the two factions. Nothing like a good old papal turf war to keep the faithful engaged. Benedict was excommunicated and declared an anti-pope, one of many in church history who claimed the title without the church's blessing. But here's where it gets juicy. Facing military defeat and political isolation, Benedict didn't just surrender, he faked his death. Allegedly. Mainstream historians say Benedict X was eventually deposed and retired quietly to a monastery. But some fringe accounts suggest something much stranger. That he staged his own death, complete with a decoy corpse, and fled Rome under disguise. One theory claims he resurfaced years later under another name, advising nobles in southern Italy. Another suggests he became a hermit in the Alps, leaving cryptic writings behind. Fringe fact. A 12th century monk claimed to have seen a mad bishop with papal rings living in a cave, muttering in Latin and refusing to eat anything but figs. Was it Benedict? Probably not. But the legend stuck around long enough to make it into a few shadowy Vatican footnotes. The open scholarly debate centres on how Benedict X even got elected in the first place. Was it outright bribery, noble pressure, or did the cardinals simply get outmanoeuvred? It's still unclear. But what's certain is that his brief reign helped fuel the church's push for electoral reform. Soon after, popes were chosen exclusively by cardinals, a system still used today. You imagine it now, Benedict, wrapped in a worn travelling cloak, slipping through city gates under moonlight. Behind him, Rome churns with rumour. Ahead, silence. No more processions, no more crowds. Just the ghost of a throne he once held, and fled. There's something beautifully anticlimactic about it. No dramatic trial, no grand rebellion. Just one man too cornered to fight, too proud to beg, choosing instead to vanish. And even in exile, he remained a symbol of corruption, of confusion, of an age when popes rose and fell like storm clouds, and the line between saint and schemer was thinner than a page of parchment. So tonight, as the candle burns low, keep an ear out for rustling cloaks. Not all popes died in Rome. Some just disappeared. You're drifting now into a quieter chamber, but the silence here crackles with tension. It's not the silence of reverence. It's the pause before a papal mic drop. Because while popes were busy with politics, power, and questionable party planning, they were also elite-level grudge holders. And when they clapped back, oh, it echoed for centuries. You're about to hear the sassiest papal burns history forgot to highlight. Take Pope Gregory VII, for example. In the 11th century, he went head-to-head with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV during the investiture controversy. Basically, they fought over who got to pick bishops. Henry said, "Me." Gregory said, "You thought." So Gregory excommunicated him twice. Henry was forced to do the ultimate medieval walk of shame, barefoot in the snow for 3 days, outside a castle in Canossa, begging for forgiveness. And Gregory, he made him wait just long enough to feel it. That's not diplomacy, that's icy precision. Mainstream historians agree, papal excommunication was the ultimate spiritual power move. A pope could cut off a king from the church, which also meant cutting him off from legitimacy. It was like being publicly deleted, but with eternal consequences. And popes didn't stop with kings. They went after entire cities. Pope Innocent III once placed all of England under interdict for 6 years, forbidding all public worship and sacraments. Why? Because King John refused to accept the Pope's choice for archbishop. That's the equivalent of turning off a kingdom's Wi-Fi over a bad hiring decision. Fringe fact: Pope John XXII reportedly sent a letter to a heretical bishop that was just 3 words long. Roughly translated, "Number. Sit down." Okay, it was more formal than that, but you get the idea. Sometimes holy smackdowns came with a wax seal and the sting of eternal shade. There's even a documented instance where a pope excommunicated a swarm of locusts. Seriously, Pope Stephen VI declared them anathema after they ruined crops in central Italy. Did it work? The bugs didn't write back, but the farmers probably appreciated the gesture. The big scholarly debate is about effectiveness. Were these excommunications and papal decrees genuinely powerful tools of control, or just symbolic theatre? Some historians argue that papal letters were more about performance than outcome. Others say the fear of hellfire was very real in medieval minds, and a pope's words held unmatched psychological weight. Then there's the art of the papal letter. You'd think these things were stiff and formal, right? Wrong. Some were dripping with sarcasm. Some quoted scripture like daggers. Others were so condescending you could feel the cardinal's monocle shattering from across the room. Imagine Pope Boniface VIII writing to the King of France in 1302, "God has placed us above kings and kingdoms. Translation, you exist because we let you. Mic drop, quill drop, eternal consequences." And don't forget the dramatic gestures. Popes would sometimes burn official letters from monarchs in public, or post bulls of excommunication on church doors at sunrise, just in time for morning mass crowds. Petty? Maybe. Effective? Definitely. You picture it now, the papal secretary rolling out a scroll, reading aloud in front of a stunned crowd. To the king, who forgets his place. And behind him, the Pope leans back in his chair, sipping something warm, already thinking of his next zinger. Tonight, you don't just hear echoes of theology, you hear the rhythm of medieval shade. Papal diplomacy wrapped in Latin, sealed with wax, and sharpened like a sword. Not every pope had a lover. Not every pope led armies. But every pope had a pen, and they knew how to use it. The lantern burns low now, golden and tired. Shadows lean long across the floor, and your thoughts begin to settle. But there's one last tale to tell. One more turn before the candle goes out. Tonight, you return to the throne itself, the seat of St. Peter, where centuries of scandal, ambition, and holy theatre have left their mark. We end with a pope who was not the most outrageous, not the most theatrical, but symbolic of the truth at the heart of all this. That the papacy was, and still is, a paradox, a symbol of divine grace, often seated by deeply human hands. This final moment belongs to Pope Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici. Born into wealth, raised among artists and thinkers, Leo didn't so much climb to the papacy as inherit it with a flourish. He was crowned in 1513. Rome glittered with Renaissance art. The church pulsed with wealth. And Leo? He partied like the kingdom of heaven had already arrived. He once declared, reportedly with a wink, "Let us enjoy the papacy, since God has given it to us." Honest, at least. Mainstream historians describe Leo as a pope more interested in patronage than piety. Under his reign, Michelangelo and Raphael flourished. He loved books, plays, and elaborate banquets where sugar sculptures of saints melted under candlelight. But while the feasts raged, a storm brewed. The church, bloated by simony, indulgences, and politics, had alienated its people. And in 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, an act that would tear Christendom in two. That's right, the Reformation began under Leo's silk-slippered watch. Here's the fringe angle. Some chroniclers claim Leo thought the whole Luther thing was just a local spat. He didn't take it seriously. He saw the monk as an angry academic, not a spark in a dry forest. By the time he realized the fire had spread, it was too late. Scholars still argue, was Leo a careless hedonist who failed to see the church's unraveling? Or was he a product of his age, one last Renaissance prince, doing what princes do? Either way, his reign marked a turning point. The world changed, the veil lifted, and the scandals you've heard tonight, orgies, poisonings, political vendettas, and golden elephants, suddenly weren't just gossip. They became evidence for reformers, fuel for revolutions, and kindling for war. And yet, through all of it, the church endured. You sit now, back where you started, beneath the dome of St. Peter's. Wind stirs the trees outside. The echoes of scandal have grown quiet. The whispers have faded into marble. And the throne, still there. Carved from contradictions, made holy not by perfection, but by perseverance. Not every pope was a monster. Many were kind, faithful, even saintly. But tonight wasn't about saints. It was about the strange, the shocking, the deeply human. Because even in the most sacred spaces, people leave fingerprints. So if you're still awake, let your mind drift. Let the candles burn down. Let the sound of silk and sin and scribbled curses fade into memory. We've reached the end of our path through the scandalous papacy. But stay with me just a little longer. The wind down begins now. Shh. Breathe out. You've walked through centuries of candlelight and chaos, through marble halls and secret tunnels, past laughter, curses, betrayals, and velvet-draped secrets. You've met boy popes and warrior popes, popes who vanished, and popes who wrote steamy poetry. And somehow, through all that absurdity, you made it here. Now let it all go. Let the popes put away their crowns. Let the ink dry on forgotten excommunications. Let the whispers of cardinals and queens soften into nothing. Imagine the Vatican at night, its stones resting, its gardens still, the torchlight flickering low beneath the weight of too many stories. Take a breath, deeper now. The drama is over. Outside, the river moves slowly past Rome's old walls. The stars hang above St. Peter's like tiny halos, and the air carries the hush of centuries. No crowds, no choirs, just quiet. Even in scandal, history offers comfort, proof that things have always been messy, that power tempts, even in holy robes, and that people, no matter the title, will always be people. So close your eyes if you haven't already. Let the final footsteps fade. Let your thoughts slow like candle wax pooling in a dish. You're safe here. The past can't reach you now. It's just a story, one long exhale, already drifting away. Sleep easy.